So today I'd like to talk to you guys about mass communication, what it is and how it allows you to communicate anonymously. What it is and how it allows you to communicate anonymously with another person. I'll also be talking about metadata and how you can use metadata and mass communication to build a really powerful application. So I know that was a lot to take in, but by the end of this workshop, we'll all have a better understanding of what that means. So just to run you through the agenda, I'll be starting off with metadata, talking about what it is, talking you through an example, and showing you a quick demo on how it works. I'll then be covering off mass communication, talking about its use cases and how using the concept of mass communication and metadata, you can build a really cool application called Chameleon SMS. We'll then have a Q&A session, followed by a walkthrough demo where I'll show you step-by-step how you can set up Chameleon SMS on your machine. And we'll conclude it with Playtime, where you can have a go at the code yourself. So a bit about myself. My name's Ibrahim Tareq. I'm a developer evangelist at Message Media. So I look after the developer community by building out dev assets like API documentation and technical articles. I support developer questions and queries about our APIs and SDKs. And I work with the product and tech team to improve the overall developer experience of our products. All right, let's kick it off with metadata. Hands up if you're a web developer or if you've written HTML code before. Oh, sweet. So for those who haven't done any HTML coding before, so what I've got up on the screen is a section from an HTML page, and what you're looking at is a set of meta tags. And the purpose of a meta tag is to provide additional information about an HTML document. Right? And that's basically what metadata is. It provides additional information about something. And similar to how you have metadata in the world of web, you've got messaging metadata. And messaging metadata allows you to attach data to a message. And then you can have this data returned to you when a message is sent, when a reply is received, or via reporting API. And for those of you who don't know, reporting API allows you to run reports on messages sent and received using our messaging API. So what I've got there on the screen is the body of our send message request. And the send message request is a post request that you'd send to our messaging API if you want to send a message to someone. So as you can see, I've highlighted metadata in red. You can have metadata as a field in your send message request. And although I've got 2 key value pairs in there, you can have up to 20. And for each pair, you can have, so the value of each pair can have up to 1,000 characters, given that it's stringified. So you can actually fit in quite a lot of information as part of your metadata. Now, you're probably wondering, why would I want to do that? So to help clarify the concept of metadata, take you through the scenario. And you might recognize this from Ben's workshop earlier on webhooks. So what I've done is I've used the same diagram to help explain the concept of metadata. So what I've got up there on the screen is I've got Dr. Smith and her patient management system. And she obviously uses the patient management system to manage her patients. And one of the features of the patient management system is to send appointment reminders to her patients. And it does that using our messaging API. Now, let's say I've got an appointment tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. and I receive a notification for that today, which says, "Hi, Ibrahim, your appointment with Dr. Smith is at 9:30 a.m. Reply yes to confirm or no to cancel." So I open up my calendar, and my slot for 9:30 a.m. is still free, right? So I reply with yes. Now, what's going to happen when I reply with yes is it's going to fire a webhook to the patient management system. The patient management system will then go and query the patient database, look for my patient record, update it with my booking details, and then it will go ahead and update the doctor's calendar. And that's how you'd normally do it. What metadata does is it simplifies the entire process. So the initial message that I receive will already have metadata embedded in it. And as you can see, it's highlighted in red again. And I've got 2 key pair values in there again, but you're not restricted to just 2. You can have more information in there. So you can possibly add in the appointment ID or the name of the doctor with whom you have your appointment. Now this time, when I reply with yes, what's going to happen is a webhook gets fired back to the patient management system, but this time, my reply will have metadata embedded in it. And this is the same metadata that was sent in the initial message. So what this means is metadata is persisted for the entire duration of the conversation. It's not a one-way thing where if you send a message, you've got metadata, but then in the reply, the metadata disappears. So it's there for the entire conversation. What the patient management system is now going to do is, because it's got all the information that it needs, it can go ahead and update the doctor's calendar without having to look up the database. So it doesn't need to make that extra lookup to the database to find out my record. Now, what I'd like to do is to show you guys a quick demo of how this works. So what I've got on the screen is a code sample from our Node.js SDK for the messaging API. And this specific code sample allows you to send message. So if you follow the laser, what I've got up there is the content, which is similar to the patient-doctor example. I've added the destination number for that phone on the right-hand side. And the callback URL is a webhook catcher that we can use to inspect the request that will be sent to it. And then I've got the metadata in there as well. So what I'll do now is I'll run a bit of code to send that message. Cool. I'll open up that message just to make sure that it was indeed the message that we sent using the bit of code. Yep, all good. So now our webhook catcher should have received 2 DRs. And if I open up one of the DRs at the bottom, you can see that metadata was embedded as part of the message. Now let's see what happens when you reply to that message. So reply with yes. And another DR should pop up on the column. Yep, so if you open that up, and if I inspect it and go all the way to the bottom and highlight that bit, you can see that the same metadata was returned in the reply. So some of the benefits of the metadata approach are you save time, since there's less overhead involved, as you don't have to query the database each time a reply is received. And you can potentially build a stateless application. Since you're storing all of your data as part of your metadata, you don't have to store states anymore. And you can run analytics. And the way you do this is by using a reporting API to filter out messages based on specific metadata. So an example of this would be, say you're sending out messages and you've got Dr. Smith's name as part of your metadata. You can run a report by filtering out all messages that have Dr. Smith as the metadata value, and then you can end up with a list of all the messages that were sent to Dr. Smith, or that was sent from Dr. Smith. So metadata can be quite powerful, and one other use case of metadata is mass communication. Hands up if you called a ride-sharing service to get to the convention center today. Cool. And did anyone have any sort of interaction with the driver before they got in the car? Like a text message or a phone call? No one? All right, guess it was just me. Well, the way it works is if you want to contact your Uber driver, you'd open up the app, you'd press the contact button, which would then show you 2 options, call and message. And say on this occasion, we'd like to message the driver, so we press the message button and we send the message. Now, if you've done this before, you would have noticed that the number you texted to isn't the driver's actual number. You texted a dedicated number. And what a dedicated number is, it's a number that allows you to send and receive messages from the same number every time, always. So what happened was your text message got sent to the dedicated number. The dedicated number then forwarded or routed that message to the driver's actual number. So rather than connecting both parties directly, you've used a bridge to connect them. And by doing so, you've safeguarded the private information, right? And that bridge is what a dedicated number is. Now, mass communication isn't restricted to ride-sharing services like Uber, where you have riders and drivers. You can also have it for other businesses like Airbnb, where you've got guest and host, or marketplaces like eBay and Gumtree, where you have buyers and sellers. And the reason why businesses like to use mass communication is because of A, privacy. Since you're keeping both parties' contact details private, you're creating a safe environment without disrupting communication. And B, customer experience. So knowing that my personal contact detail is kept hidden and safe, I'm more comfortable and more likely to engage with the end user or the business. Now, to help understand this concept even better, I'd like to introduce you to Uncle Joe's Pizza Shop. And I'd like to use this as an example to help us really understand what it is that we're talking about in this sort of communication. Now, like a lot of other pizza shops, Uncle Joe's does pizza deliveries. And most of the time, the pizzas get delivered on time and everyone's happy. But then over the weekends, and especially during peak hours, the deliveries might get delayed. What the customers do then is they get impatient, and then they call up the pizza store, and they ask them, where's my pizza? The pizza store then contacts the delivery driver, and the delivery driver then gets back to the pizza shop then gets back to you. Now, I'm pretty sure many of you can relate to this frustrating and time-consuming experience. So Uncle Joe thought of a possible solution to this communication challenge. And his solution was to connect the driver and the customer directly. So essentially handing out the contact details of the driver to the customer and the customer's contact details to the driver, right? And using this approach, the customer can get real-time updates. So I can call up the driver anytime I want and ask him where my pizza is, rather than having to wait for the pizza store to get back to me. But there are a couple of problems with this approach. So the first problem is privacy. Do you really want to hand out your customer and your driver's contact details? Is that considered good practice? What if your driver calls up the customer the next day and starts harassing them? Right? And what about the status of the delivery? Can you tell when the delivery has been, well, if the delivery has been delayed or if it's been delivered or if the driver has forgotten about the delivery? You can't, because you're not part of the conversation. And because you're not part of the conversation, you can't really control it. So what if the conversation starts going off topic? What do you do then? So a better solution would be to use mass communication, where both parties can stay anonymous, but they can still communicate via a dedicated number. And you can actually set this up using message media. And the way you do it is step one, you'd buy a set of dedicated numbers from message media. Once again, a dedicated number is a number that you can use to send messages and receive from the same number, always. And step two, in your application, in your database, you'd have some sort of a mapping and matching. So for the sake of simplicity, let's say we've got one customer and one driver, and say the customer is Ben. So in your database, you'd create a record which would say the customer is Ben, the driver is someone, and then you've assigned a dedicated number to both the parties, and you save that as a record in your database. So what happens in step three is if Ben wants to know more about his order, he texts the dedicated number. What message media will then do is it will look up the database, look for that record that says that Ben's pizza delivery driver's contact details is this. It would then grab that contact detail, and in step 5, it would forward the text message to the driver. So to get that system up and running, there are a few bits involved. So you'd have to set up a web server, you'd have to set up a database, you'd have to write code for that mapping and matching, and you'd have to test that code and maintain it to make sure that it's all working. And that can easily become very resource intensive and very time consuming. And you'll also have to take into consideration how many numbers you'll need. So if your driver is having one active conversation with one customer, that's one dedicated number. Now, if you've got 5 customers talking to the same driver, you'll need 5. So if your business gets bigger and bigger, you'll need the ability to scale. And even then, you don't know what's happening with the conversations, right? So one way to solve that problem would be to store all of that conversation and messaging data in your database. But what if I told you that you don't need to store the data? You don't need a database, and you don't need to do all this heavy lifting. There's a much cleaner, more efficient way to do this. And that's exactly what Chameleon SMS is. So Chameleon SMS is a way of building a mass communication application using metadata. And the really cool part about Chameleon SMS is it's open source. It's up on GitHub, so you can actually tweak it and change it and do really cool stuff with it. So the way Chameleon SMS works is in two parts. So in the first part, initiation, what happens is if two parties would like to start communicating with each other, Chameleon SMS will dynamically assign a number for that conversation, and it would then send off an initial text message to the customer. In the second part, conversation, the customer starts communicating with the driver using that dedicated number that was assigned to them. And the best part about Chameleon SMS is it's purely database-less. So data about your conversation is held in the metadata, which is then persisted for the entire duration of the conversation. And by doing this, you're eliminating the need to maintain a database, right? So think about how much time and money you'd save by not having to maintain a database because you don't have one. Now let's take a step back and go back to the pizza example. So to set up that system, you'd have to create a database, you'd have to write code for the mapping and matching, and you'd have to set up a web server to run all of that code. Using Chameleon SMS, well, for starters, Chameleon SMS takes care of all of that for you, and using Chameleon SMS, you don't need a database. And since all of your data is being persisted in the metadata, you can potentially have a stateless application, and you can deploy that stateless application to Lambda and run it as a serverless application. So let's say a customer ordered a pizza. And now you've assigned a delivery driver for that order. You'd want to initiate that conversation in Chameleon SMS. The way you do that is step one, you'd create a post request with the details of the conversation. And by details, I mean the contact details of both the parties, and then the message that you'd like to send to both the parties, and then finally you'd have the end time of the conversation. So you're controlling when the conversation comes to an end. And what you'll then do is you'll send off the request to the API, and Chameleon SMS takes care of the rest for you. That's how Chameleon SMS works. There is another use case of metadata that I'd like to talk to you about, and that is A/B marketing campaigns. And the way A/B marketing campaign works is you'll have two different marketing messages. So say the first marketing message says, hurry sale 10 on the 20th of 10, and the second one is 50% off all store items. So what I'll do is, so the way metadata fits into this picture is, so for the first marketing message, I'll embed metadata into it, and my metadata value would be campaign ID 1, just so that I can identify it. The second one would be campaign ID 2, right? And then what I'll do is I'll send out those marketing messages to my customer base, and then at the end of the month, I'll run a report on all the messages, so messages sent and replies received, that contain the metadata values that I specified earlier, so campaign ID 1 and campaign ID 2. And by doing this, I can find out which campaign was more successful, right? So to wrap things up, metadata has a variety of use cases, starting from patient management system to mass communication application to A/B marketing campaigns. Metadata allows you to add additional information to your message. And by doing so, you're eliminating the need to maintain or even have a database in the first place. And by doing that, you're saving time and money. You can also have a stateless application using metadata, and you can run reports on your messages that have metadata by using a reporting API. Do you have any questions?
Is this metadata a default feature, or is there a cost associated with it?
It's completely free. So metadata comes with all the messages. If you were to actually build a Chameleon SMS application, if you were to run it on your machine, the only thing that you'd be paying for are the dedicated numbers, but other than that, everything else is free. Yep.
How does the routing from the dedicated numbers to the actual receivers work?
So,
How does it detect what the real destination is supposed to be?
so if I go back there, so over there, you'll be specifying the destination numbers. As for the dedicated numbers, you'd buy it from MessageMedia and set it in your Chameleon SMS application, and then Chameleon SMS would dynamically assign it. So you wouldn't have to worry about whether there's going to be some sort of a conversation clash. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. So it'll be assigned to that conversation until it ends, and you decide when that conversation comes to an end. Yep. Yep. So for example, if say we've got one dedicated number, using that, you and I can have one conversation. Alternatively, your neighbor and say Ben can have a conversation, right? Because they're two different channels. That makes sense. But if you want to have a conversation with Ben, then you need a second dedicated number because you already have an active conversation with me using the first number. Anyone else? Cool. So I'll move on to the walkthrough demo. And what I'd like to do now is to show you step by step how you can set up Chameleon SMS on your machine. But before I do that, there's a few prerequisites that I'd like to call out. So A, you'll need your API credentials in handy. I'm pretty sure you've been using it throughout the day. So make sure you have it ready to go. The second thing is you'll need a dedicated number assigned to your account. We've already done that for you, and you should have received it in Slack. If you haven't, come see one of us in a blue t-shirt, and we'll help you out. And the last three things you'll need installed on your system are Node, ngrok, and Postman. Just so you know, you'll have all these instructions in a README file in the USB on your lanyard. So you can follow the instructions later, or you can follow me as I walk you through on how to set it up right now. So the first thing that I'll be doing is setting up or starting up ngrok on my machine. So to do that, I'll open up the command line, and I'll type in the command ngrok http 3000. And 3000 is the port on which ngrok will be running on. So if everything goes well, you should see the online status shown in green at the top. That's awesome. Our next step is to clone the repository onto our machine. But before I do that, I'm just going to open up another command line and cd into the directory where I'd like to clone my repository. Then go into the repository, copy the URL, and then git clone, paste it into the command line. We'll give that a few seconds. So once that's all done, you can open up the directory just to make sure that all your files and folders have been successfully cloned. What I'm going to do next is install the dependencies that I need for the project. And I can do that by running npm install from the root directory of the repository. Now, this might take a couple of seconds, so what I'll do in the meantime is I'll create a file, again in the root directory, and and in this file we'll have all the environmental variables needed for the project. So if you go into README, you should find a section with all the environmental variables. I'll copy that, paste it into the file, and what I'll do next is I'll start replacing the placeholder with the actual values. So I'll start off with my API key, and then I'll do my secret. For the port number, you'll have to be careful here. Your port has to be the same as the port on which ngrok is running. So I started ngrok on 3000, so for my application, the port number would be 3000 as well. So type that in, and then for the URL, you can choose any one next to localhost. It doesn't really matter at this point, it's just one is more secure than the other. But since we're running locally, it doesn't really matter. So for my demo, I'll be using the first one. Paste that in, and make sure you've appended /incoming to your URL. The last thing I'm going to do is add in my dedicated number. Cool. Save that as a .env file. Bear with me while it loads. Now what I'm going to do next is I'll start up the node server on my machine, and I can do that by running the command npm start. If all goes well, you should see Chameleon listening on port, whatever it is, the port number that you used. So for me, it was 3000, as you can see, that showed up, so it's all good. The next step is to import the Postman collection, which has the request that's needed to initiate Chameleon SMS. So if you click on that button, it'll import it for you. Just give it a few seconds to load. So once that's done, on the left-hand side, you'll see Chameleon SMS as a collection. So click on the first request and then select basic auth as your authorization type. And then for your username value, replace it with your API key, and your password should be your API secret. So once you've done that, the last step is to replace the Postman URL with your actual ngrok URL. So copy that and paste it there. So now we're all set and ready to go. What I'll be doing now is I'll bring up two phones and show you a quick demo of how this would work between two phones. Cool. So now if I hit send, I'll receive a message on both the phones. There we go. So I'll open up one of the messages. And I'll reply to it. And obviously the reply will be seen on the other phone. Now, notice how both the messages originated from the same number. So normally if you were to message someone else, or if you were to text someone, you'd have two different numbers on both phones. But in this case, both messages originated from the same number. And this is the beauty of how dedicated numbers work. So normally if you were to send a message using our API, you'd get a different number. So you'd get the message originating from a different number each time. But using dedicated number, you can set that source number. So now it's just exchanging text between both the phones, Chameleon SMS in action. And yeah, that's how you set Chameleon SMS up on your machine.